The stagecoach door swung open before it even came to a complete stop, and Grace Morrison stumbled out onto the dusty main street of Yreka, California, her threadbare traveling dress clinging to her thin frame while three men in expensive suits emerged from the building behind her like vultures circling prey. It was August of 1876, and the late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Northern California mining town, turning the air thick and heavy with heat. Grace's dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins during the long journey, and she pushed it back from her face with trembling fingers as she clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest. Inside were all her worldly possessions: 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a daguerreotype of her late mother, and a stack of papers that documented every penny she owed to the men who now stood blocking the afternoon light. "Miss Morrison, running away does not erase your obligations," the tallest of the 3 men said, his voice carrying across the street. Several townsfolk stopped to watch the scene unfold. "Your father's debts became yours when he passed. $2,300 does not simply disappear." Grace's cheeks flushed hot with humiliation and anger. "My father died 6 months ago. I have been trying to pay what he owed, but you added interest that compounds faster than anyone could possibly manage. I came here to marry Mr. Thornton, who promised me a fresh start. Where is he?" The 3 debt collectors exchanged glances, and something like amusement flickered across their faces. The tall one pulled out a piece of paper. "Ah, yes, Mr. Edgar Thornton. I'm afraid you will find him at the Yreka cemetery. He died of pneumonia 3 weeks ago." No one thought to inform his mail-order bride, apparently. The world tilted beneath Grace's feet. She had traveled all the way from Missouri, enduring weeks of uncomfortable stagecoach rides and train transfers, sleeping in questionable lodging houses, spending the last of her money on passage to this remote mining town in the shadow of Mount Shasta. And the man who was supposed to marry her and provide her with a new life was dead. The debt collectors had followed her here, which meant they had known all along and had simply waited to see what she would do. "I have no money to pay you today," Grace said, forcing her voice to remain steady even as panic clawed at her chest. "But I will find work. I will pay every cent, I swear it. The problem, Miss Morrison, is that your word means very little when your father made similar promises and then drank himself into an early grave," the debt collector said. "We have legal authority to seize any assets you possess, and to have you arrested for fraud if you cannot satisfy even a portion of this debt within the next 48 hours. I possess nothing but the clothes I am wearing and the contents of this bag," Grace said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "What exactly do you intend to seize? Your labor, perhaps? There are establishments that would be happy to work off your debt through, shall we say, alternative means." The implication hung in the air like poison. Grace felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had survived her father's alcoholism, her mother's death from consumption, the loss of their small home, and the humiliation of having to arrange her own mail-order marriage. She would survive this too somehow. "That will not be necessary, gentlemen." The voice came from behind the debt collectors, deep and calm and carrying an authority that made all 3 men turn. Grace looked past them to see a man approaching from across the street. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his days doing hard physical labor. He wore dusty work clothes, brown canvas trousers, and a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing tanned, strong forearms. A worn brown hat shaded his face, but as he came closer, Grace could see he had dark hair that needed cutting and striking blue eyes that assessed the situation with quick intelligence. "This does not concern you, Mr. Fletcher," the tall debt collector said, his tone changing to something more cautious. "When men come into my town and threaten a woman on the street, it concerns me," the man said, stopping a few feet away. He was probably in his late 20s, Grace guessed, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days of stubble and a face that was handsome in a rough, weathered way. "Miss, are you all right?" Grace found her voice. "I am unharmed, but these men claim I owe them $2,300 for debts my father incurred before his death. They followed me here from Missouri." The cowboy's blue eyes flickered with something that might have been anger, but his expression remained calm. $2,300 is a considerable sum. What was the original debt? The debt collector shifted uncomfortably. The principal amount was $800, but with interest and collection fees over the past 18 months, you have nearly tripled the debt through compounding interest on a grieving daughter, Xavier Fletcher said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "That seems excessive, even by your standards, Mr. Carmichael." "It is all legal and documented," Carmichael insisted. The young lady signed papers acknowledging her responsibility. "I signed because you said you would give me time to earn the money," Grace said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "You said you would be reasonable. Instead, you have hounded me at every turn, adding fees for every letter you sent, every visit you made. I have been trying to pay, but you made it impossible." Xavier Fletcher looked at Grace for a long moment, and she felt as though he could see straight through her careful facade to the terrified, exhausted woman beneath. Then he turned back to the debt collectors. "I will pay the original principal amount of $800, today, in cash. The rest of your imaginary fees and interest can disappear back to whatever hell spawned them," Grace gasped. "Sir, you cannot. You do not even know me." "Why would you? 800 is unacceptable," Carmichael interrupted. "The legal debt is 2,300, and that is what must be paid." Xavier Fletcher pulled out a small leather pouch from his pocket and tossed it to the debt collector, who caught it reflexively. "There is $900 in gold there. 100 more than the original debt, which should more than cover any legitimate expenses you incurred. Take it and leave, or I will go get the sheriff, and we can discuss your debt collection practices in front of a judge. I know for a fact that California law does not look kindly on predatory lending, especially when it targets women who have recently lost their fathers." The three debt collectors huddled together, speaking in low voices while weighing the pouch of gold. Grace watched in disbelief, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This stranger was giving away $900 for her, someone he had never met, someone who had stumbled into his town as a failed mail-order bride with nothing to her name. Finally, Carmichael turned back to them. "We will accept $900 as payment in full, but we require Miss Morrison to sign a document releasing her from all further obligation." "I have paper and a pen at my ranch," Xavier said. "We will ride out there now. You will prepare your document, she will sign it, and then you will get on the next stagecoach out of Yreka and never return. Do we have an understanding?" The debt collectors agreed, though they looked unhappy about it. Xavier turned to Grace, and up close she could see that his eyes were not just blue but had small flecks of gray in them, like storm clouds gathering. "Miss, I apologize for not introducing myself properly. My name is Xavier Fletcher. I own a cattle ranch about 5 miles outside of town. I promise you that I mean you no harm, but if we are going to settle this matter, we need to do it properly with witnesses and documentation. Will you trust me long enough to ride out to my property?" Grace looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and an unexpected kindness. She was taking a risk, she knew that. But this man had just saved her from a fate she did not want to contemplate, and something in her gut told her he was telling the truth about meaning her no harm. "Yes," she said quietly. "I will trust you, Mr. Fletcher, and thank you. I do not know how I will ever repay you, but I swear I will find a way." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first break in his serious expression. "Let us settle one crisis at a time, Miss Morrison. Come on, my horse is tied up at the general store." The ride out to the Fletcher ranch took about 45 minutes, with Grace riding behind Xavier on his large bay gelding while the 3 debt collectors followed in a rented wagon. Grace had never been this close to a man who was not family, and she found herself acutely aware of the solid warmth of Xavier's back against her hands, the easy way he controlled the powerful horse beneath them, the faint scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. She tried not to think about how her arms were wrapped around his waist, or how her face was close enough to his shoulder that she could see individual threads in his shirt. The Fletcher ranch appeared as they crested a small hill, and Grace caught her breath at the sight. It was not a grand estate, but it was clearly prosperous and well-maintained. A 2-story ranch house painted white with dark blue shutters sat at the center of the property, surrounded by a split-rail fence that enclosed a kitchen garden bursting with late summer vegetables. Beyond the house were several outbuildings including a large barn, a stable, a bunkhouse for ranch hands, and various storage sheds. Cattle grazed in the distant pastures, and she could see several men working with horses in a corral near the barn. Xavier dismounted and then helped Grace down, his hands strong and steady on her waist. She felt her cheeks flush at the contact and looked away quickly, smoothing her dusty traveling dress with nervous hands. "Miguel," Xavier called out to one of the ranch hands, a man with sun-weathered brown skin and gray streaking his black hair. "Can you get Tom and bring them both up to the house? I need witnesses for some legal documents." The ranch hand nodded and headed toward the barn while Xavier led Grace and the debt collectors up to the house. Inside, the home was simple but comfortable, with sturdy furniture and clean wooden floors. The main room served as both a sitting area and dining space, with a stone fireplace on one wall and windows that let in generous amounts of light. Everything was neat and organized in a way that suggested Xavier lived alone and took care of his own space. "Miss Morrison, please sit down," Xavier said, gesturing to a chair at the large wooden dining table. "Can I get you some water? You must be thirsty after the journey." "Water would be wonderful, thank you," Grace said, sinking gratefully into the chair. She had not realized until that moment how exhausted she was, her body aching from days of travel, and her mind reeling from the rapid turn of events. Xavier brought her a tin cup of cool water from a pump in the kitchen area, and she drank it gratefully while the debt collectors prepared their documents. 2 ranch hands arrived shortly after, the older man named Miguel and a younger one called Tom, who looked to be in his early 20s with red hair and curious green eyes. The document was straightforward enough. It stated that Grace Morrison had paid in full the debt of $800 originally owed by her late father, plus an additional $100 for collection expenses, and that she was released from any and all further obligation. The debt collectors had wanted to write that Xavier Fletcher had paid on her behalf, which would have legally allowed them to pursue him for the remaining imagined debt. But Xavier had caught that detail and insisted the language show that Grace herself was paying through an agent of her choosing. "I am not an agent. I am paying a debt that never should have been placed on her shoulders," Xavier said flatly. "But if you want to play legal games, then the language will state that Miss Morrison has satisfied the debt through payment rendered. Period. No mention of agents or representatives. The debt collectors grumbled but rewrote the document. Grace signed it with a hand that shook only slightly, and then Miguel and Tom signed as witnesses. Carmichael counted out the gold coins from the leather pouch Xavier had given them, verified the amount, and then all three men signed their own acknowledgement that the debt was satisfied. "Our business is concluded," Xavier said, standing up in a clear gesture of dismissal. "Miguel, would you be kind enough to drive these gentlemen back to town? I believe there is a stage-coach heading south tomorrow morning." "Be happy to, boss," Miguel said with a slight grin that suggested he was enjoying the debt collector's discomfort. After the men had left, an awkward silence fell over the ranch house. Grace sat at the table, looking down at her hands, trying to process everything that had happened. Xavier had sent Tom back to work and was now standing by the window, looking out at his land. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "Mr. Fletcher," Grace began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do not know what to say. You have saved me from a terrible situation, and I have no way to repay you. $900 is more money than I have ever seen in my entire life." Xavier turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "You do not owe me anything, Miss Morrison. Those men were vultures preying on your grief and your circumstances. What they were doing was legal only in the narrowest technical sense. It was not right. But you gave them so much money," Grace said, looking up at him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. Then he walked over and sat down across from her at the table. "5 years ago, my sister found herself in a similar situation. Her husband died suddenly, leaving her with debts she did not know existed. Debt collectors came after her, threatened her, tried to force her into situations no woman should have to endure. I was away on a cattle drive when it happened, and by the time I got back, she had already made a desperate decision to protect her children. She married a man who promised to pay her debts, but he turned out to be cruel and violent. By the time I found out, it was too late. She died 2 years ago from injuries he inflicted, and the law did nothing because a man was allowed to discipline his wife however he saw fit." Grace felt her heart contract with sympathy and horror. "Oh, Mr. Fletcher, I am so sorry." "My point," Xavier continued, his voice rough with old pain, "is that I was not there to help my sister when she needed it most, but I was here today when you needed help. Maybe that does not balance the scales or bring Sarah back, but it means something to me. So you do not owe me anything except the promise that you will not let anyone push you into a situation that compromises your safety or your dignity. Can you promise me that?" Grace nodded, a tear finally escaping to slide down her cheek. "I promise. And I am truly sorry about your sister." They sat in silence for a few more moments, the weight of shared grief and unexpected connection hanging between them. Then Xavier cleared his throat and stood up. "You said you came here to marry Edgar Thornton. Do you have anywhere to stay now that he has passed?" The question brought Grace back to the harsh reality of her situation. "No. I spent the last of my money on the stagecoach fare to get here. I had hoped Mr. Thornton would meet me at the coach stop, and we would be married right away. I did not know he was dead until your debt collectors told me." "They are not my debt collectors," Xavier said with a hint of dark humor, "but I understand your meaning. Well, you cannot sleep on the street, and the boarding house in town is not a place I would recommend for a woman alone. I have a spare room here. The house is plenty big, and I have Miguel's wife Rosa who comes up from their cabin 3 times a week to cook and clean. You would be properly chaperoned, and it would give you some time to figure out what you want to do next. Grace's first instinct was to refuse. She had already accepted so much help from this man, and staying in his home seemed like an imposition beyond measure. But the practical part of her mind knew she had no other options. She had no money, no prospects, and no way to even get back to Missouri, even if she wanted to return to a place that held only painful memories. "Are you certain?" she asked. "I do not want to be a burden. Perhaps I could work for my keep. I can cook and clean and help with whatever needs doing around the ranch." Xavier looked at her for a long moment, and Grace saw something shift in his eyes, a softening that made him look younger and less weathered by the world. "You are not a burden, Miss Morrison. Stay as long as you need to. If you want to help out around the house, I would not object, but it is not a requirement. You have been through a difficult experience, and you deserve some time to rest and recover." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are the kindest man I have ever met, Mr. Fletcher." A faint blush colored his tan cheeks. "I am just a rancher who tries to do the right thing when I can. Come on, let me show you the spare room so you can settle in." The spare room was upstairs. A small but comfortable space with a real bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the front pasture. It was simple, but to Grace, who had spent the last 6 months sleeping on a narrow cot in a boarding house room she shared with 2 other women, it looked like luxury. "This is wonderful," she said, setting her worn satchel down on the bed. "Truly, Mr. Fletcher, I cannot thank you enough." "Call me Xavier," he said, standing in the doorway. "If you are going to be staying here, we should probably dispense with the formalities." "Then you should call me Grace," she replied, offering him a small smile. "Grace," he repeated, and the way he said her name, with a slight drawl and a warmth in his voice, made something flutter in her chest. "That is a beautiful name. It suits you." After Xavier left her to settle in, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the whirlwind of the day. This morning, she had been traveling toward what she thought would be a marriage of convenience to a stranger, a desperate solution to impossible circumstances. Now she was free of the debts that had haunted her for over a year, but she was also adrift, with no clear path forward and dependent on the charity of a man she had just met. She pulled out the daguerreotype of her mother from her satchel and looked at the faded image. Elizabeth Morrison had been a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, nothing like the harsh, disappointed man her father had become after her mother's death. Grace wondered what her mother would think of her situation now. Would she be proud that Grace had tried to escape the debt collectors on her own terms? Or would she be worried that her daughter was staying in the home of a bachelor rancher who, for all his apparent kindness, was still essentially a stranger? Knock on the door frame interrupted her thoughts. Xavier stood there holding a pile of fabric. "I forgot to mention, these were my sister's clothes. I have been meaning to donate them to someone who could use them, but I kept putting it off. You and Sarah were about the same size, I think. You are welcome to anything that fits." Grace stood up and took the clothes, feeling the softness of the fabric. There were several dresses, a split riding skirt, some blouses, and even a warm shawl. It was more clothing than she had owned in years. "Are you certain? These were your sister's things. They must have sentimental value." "Sarah would want them to be used by someone who needs them," Xavier said. "She was always practical about that sort of thing. Besides, she would like you. You have the same stubborn determination in your eyes." That evening, Rosa came up to the main house to cook dinner. She was a warm, motherly woman in her 50s with black hair streaked with silver and a quick smile. She welcomed Grace without question, seeming unsurprised to find a strange woman staying in Xavier's home. Over a dinner of beef stew and fresh cornbread, Rosa chattered about ranch life, the upcoming county fair, and the latest news from town, filling the potential awkwardness with easy conversation. "Mr. Fletcher is a good man," Rosa said to Grace while they were cleaning up the dishes, Xavier having excused himself to check on the horses. "He has been alone too long since his sister passed. This ranch house is too big for one person rattling around in it." "I am just staying temporarily," Grace said quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks, "until I figure out what to do next." Rosa gave her a knowing look. "Of course, dear, temporarily. We will see how temporary it turns out to be." That night, Grace lay in the comfortable bed in the spare room and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the chirp of crickets, the creak of the house settling. She thought about Xavier Fletcher and his sad story about his sister, the way he had stood up to the debt collectors without hesitation, the gentle courtesy with which he had treated her despite her desperate circumstances. She thought about his eyes, storm cloud blue and intelligent, and the way his hands had steadied her when she dismounted from his horse. She thought about the fact that he had given away $900 as easily as if it were $9, simply because he thought it was the right thing to do. Grace had agreed to marry Edgar Thornton sight unseen because she needed security and stability, not because she expected love or romance. Those things had seemed like luxuries she could not afford. But now, lying in Xavier Fletcher's spare room wearing his dead sister's nightgown, she wondered if maybe her ideas about what was possible had been too limited. She fell asleep thinking about the way Xavier had said her name, and in her dreams, she was safe. The next morning, Grace woke to golden sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. She washed her face in the basin, braided her hair, and put on one of Sarah's dresses, a simple cotton frock in a soft blue color that fit her surprisingly well. When she came downstairs, she found Xavier at the stove, cooking eggs and bacon. "Good morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I hope you slept well. Rosa does not come until this afternoon, but I can manage a basic breakfast." "Good morning," Grace replied. "You did not need to cook for me. Let me help." She moved to join him at the stove, and they worked together in an easy rhythm that felt strangely natural for two people who had only met the day before. Xavier showed her where things were kept, and Grace sliced bread and set the table while he finished cooking the eggs. Over breakfast, Xavier outlined his day. He needed to ride out to the far pasture to check on some cattle, meet with a potential buyer for some horses, and repair a fence that had been damaged in a recent summer storm. "You are welcome to rest and relax," he said. "Or if you want something to do, there are books in the sitting room and the garden could probably use some attention. But do not feel obligated to work. You are a guest, not a hired hand." "I would like to help with the garden," Grace said. "I enjoy working with plants, and it would make me feel less like I am taking advantage of your hospitality." Xavier smiled, and Grace noticed that when he smiled, his whole face transformed, becoming younger and more open. "You are not taking advantage of anything, but if gardening makes you happy, then by all means have at it. Just watch out for the chickens. They like to steal vegetables when no one is looking." He left shortly after breakfast, riding out with Miguel and Tom, and Grace spent the morning in the garden. The work was satisfying and meditative, pulling weeds and harvesting ripe tomatoes and squash while the chickens pecked around her feet. The California sun was hot but not unbearable, and a slight breeze carried the scent of pine from the nearby forests. Rosa arrived in the early afternoon, and found Grace with dirt under her fingernails and a basket full of vegetables. "Oh, you did not need to do that," Rosa said, though she looked pleased. But I am grateful. That garden gets away from me sometimes. Come on, let us go inside and make some lemonade. You must be thirsty." Over lemonade at the kitchen table, Rosa asked Grace about her journey from Missouri and her family. Grace found herself opening up more than she had expected, telling Rosa about her mother's death from consumption when Grace was 16. Her father's descent into alcoholism and gambling debts, the desperate years trying to keep their small household together while her father drank away every penny they had. "When he died, I thought I would finally be free," Grace admitted. "But instead, I found out about all these debts he had hidden from me. The debt collectors said I was legally responsible because I was his only heir. I tried to find work in the city, but respectable jobs for women do not pay enough to live on, let alone pay down thousands of dollars in debt. That is when I answered Mr. Thornton's advertisement for a mail-order bride. He seemed kind in his letters, and he offered me a fresh start far away from Missouri and the debt collectors. But he died before you arrived," Rosa said sympathetically, "and the debt collectors followed you anyway. They must have been watching me, waiting to see where I would run," Grace said bitterly. "And now I am here, free of the debt but with no prospects and no plan. I do not know what I am going to do, Rosa. Xavier has been incredibly kind, but I cannot stay here forever living off his charity." Rosa patted her hand. "Give yourself time, dear. You have been through a great deal. Something will work out. It always does." Xavier returned in the late afternoon, dusty and tired but in good spirits. The potential horse buyer had agreed to purchase 6 horses at a fair price, and the fence was repaired. He found Grace and Rosa in the kitchen preparing dinner, and he washed up at the pump outside before joining them. Dinner that evening was a lively affair, with Miguel joining them along with Tom and another ranch hand named Jim. The men talked about the work that needed doing the next day, joked with each other, and included Grace in the conversation with an easy friendliness that made her feel less like an outsider. Xavier sat at the head of the table, and Grace noticed how his men respected him, not out of fear but because he clearly treated them well and worked alongside them rather than simply giving orders. After dinner, Rosa and Miguel headed back to their cabin, and Tom and Jim went to the bunkhouse. Grace helped Xavier clean up the kitchen, washing dishes while he dried and put them away. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then Xavier said, "You did a nice job with the garden today." Rosa was impressed. "It felt good to do something useful," Grace replied. "I have felt so helpless for so long, just reacting to one crisis after another. Working with the plants, seeing something grow and thrive because of care and attention, it reminds me that not everything in life is chaos and loss." Xavier set down the dish he was drying and turned to look at her. "I know we have only known each other for a day, but I want you to know that you are not alone anymore, Grace. You have a place here for as long as you need it. No pressure, no expectations. Just a safe place to figure out what you want your life to look like." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his kindness. "Why are you being so good to me? You do not owe me anything." "Maybe I am being good to you because it is the right thing to do," Xavier said quietly. "Or maybe I am doing it because this big house has been lonely since Sarah died, and it is nice to have someone to talk to over dinner. Or maybe I am doing it because when I saw you standing on that street facing down those debt collectors with your head held high even though you were terrified, I thought you were the bravest person I had seen in a long time. Take your pick of reasons." Grace felt her heart skip a beat. She looked up into Xavier's blue eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. It was not pity or even just kindness. It was genuine admiration and something else, something warmer and more complicated. "I am not brave," she whispered. "I am scared all the time." Bravery is not the absence of fear, Xavier said, stepping slightly closer. It is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You traveled across half the country alone to escape an impossible situation and start over. That takes courage. They stood there in the kitchen, close enough that Grace could see the faint scar on Xavier's chin and the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. She wondered what would happen if she reached up and touched his face, if he would pull away or lean into her hand. The thought shocked her with its intensity. She had never felt this way about anyone, not even about Edgar Thornton, who she had been prepared to marry. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and then Xavier stepped back, clearing his throat. I should go check on the horses before it gets full dark. Sleep well, Grace. He left before she could respond, and Grace stood alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding and her hands trembling slightly. Something was happening between them, something unexpected and powerful, and she had no idea what to do about it. The days that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Grace helped with the garden and the chickens, assisted Rosa with cooking and preserving the late summer harvest, and gradually began to feel less like a guest and more like part of the ranch household. Xavier was often gone during the day managing ranch business, but in the evenings, they would sit together on the front porch, talking about everything and nothing while the sun set behind the mountains. Grace learned that Xavier was 28 years old and had been running the ranch for 7 years, having bought the property with money saved from years of working cattle drives. He had been engaged once, to a woman from Sacramento, but she had broken it off when she realized how isolated ranch life could be. She wanted parties and society and city living, Xavier said. I wanted land and cattle and open sky. We were not suited for each other. Grace told him about her childhood before her mother died, about learning to read from her mother's books, about the small garden they had kept behind their house in Missouri. I wanted to be a teacher, she admitted. But when my mother got sick, I had to leave school to take care of her. And after she died, there was never time or money to go back. You could still teach, Xavier said. Yreka has a small schoolhouse. I do not know if they need another teacher right now, but it would be worth asking. The idea took root in Grace's mind. Teaching would give her purpose and independence. She would not be dependent on Xavier's charity forever. She could earn her own money, maybe even rent a small place in town eventually. The thought should have made her happy, but instead, she felt a strange reluctance at the idea of leaving the ranch. 3 weeks after Grace arrived at the Fletcher ranch, a letter came from Missouri. It was from a woman named Martha Brennan, who had been Grace's neighbor and one of her mother's closest friends. The letter explained that after Grace left, Martha had gone through some of Grace's father's old papers that had been left in storage. She had found documents showing that the $800 debt was actually bogus, created by forging her father's signature after he had died. The debt collectors had been running a scam, targeting grieving family members with fabricated debts and using intimidation to extract money. Martha had taken the evidence to a lawyer who had contacted authorities. The 3 debt collectors, including Carmichael, had been arrested and charged with fraud. Martha wrote that she was sorry she had not discovered this sooner, but she hoped Grace was safe and doing well in California. Grace read the letter twice, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and vindication. Xavier found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the paper, and when she explained what it said, his face darkened with fury. "Those bastards," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They were running a con, and they nearly destroyed your life over it, and I paid them $900 for a debt that never existed." "I am so sorry," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "You lost all that money because of me, because of a lie. Xavier knelt down beside her chair and took her hands in his. "Grace, look at me. This is not your fault. You were a victim of criminals. And yes, I am angry I gave money to those thieves, but I am not angry at you. You understand. I would pay that $900 again in a heartbeat if it meant keeping you safe. But it was so much money," Grace said, her voice breaking. "And now I cannot even pay you back because the debt was not real." "I do not want you to pay me back," Xavier said firmly. "I want you to understand that you did nothing wrong. You were honest and honorable in a situation where dishonest people took advantage of you. That speaks to your character, not theirs." Grace looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and fierce protectiveness. Without thinking, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Xavier stiffened for a moment in surprise, and then his arms came around her, holding her close while she cried against his shoulder. "I was so scared," she whispered into his shirt. "For so long I was so scared and alone, and I thought I would never be free of that debt. And then you appeared and you saved me, and I did not even know if the debt was real. What if you had not been there that day?" "But I was there," Xavier said quietly, one of his hands coming up to stroke her hair. "And you are safe now. You are not alone anymore, Grace. I promise you that." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the kitchen while late afternoon lights slanted through the windows. When Grace finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, she saw that Xavier's expression had changed. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his blue eyes dark and searching. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, her heart starting to pound. "I think I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and wonderful. Grace stared at him, her mind racing. She thought about the past 3 weeks, about the way she looked forward to seeing Xavier every evening, the way her heart would lift when she heard his voice or his footsteps on the porch. She thought about how safe she felt here, not just physically, but emotionally. How Xavier listened when she talked and treated her opinions with respect. She thought about how she had started imagining a future that included him, even though she had told herself it was impossible. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. And then suddenly they were kissing, his hands cupping her face while her fingers tangled in his hair. It was Grace's first real kiss, and it was everything she had never let herself dream about, passionate and tender and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I did not plan this," he said. "I invited you here to give you a safe place, not to court you. But Grace, every day I spend with you, I fall a little deeper. You are smart and strong and kind, and being around you makes me happier than I have been in years." "I feel the same way," Grace said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But Xavier, I have nothing to offer you, no money, no prospects, nothing but myself." "Yourself is everything," Xavier said, pulling back to look at her. "Grace Morrison, I do not need you to bring wealth or connections. I need you to bring yourself, your laughter, your courage, your presence. That is all I want. Are you saying what I think you are saying?" Grace asked, barely daring to hope. Xavier took a deep breath. "I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other for 3 weeks, but I also know that I do not want you to move to town and visit on weekends. I do not want you to be my friend or my housekeeper or my temporary guest. I want you to be my wife, Grace. I want to wake up with you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, here on this ranch or wherever else you want to be. Will you marry me?" Grace felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." He kissed her again, lifting her right off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools, and Grace felt lighter than she had in years, as if all the weight and fear and grief she had been carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "We should do it soon," Xavier said. "Not because I am worried you will change your mind, but because I do not want to wait any longer than necessary. Is that all right?" "That is more than all right," Grace said. "I came to California to marry a stranger. Instead, I am going to marry the man I love. That seems like the better option." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Yreka, with Rosa and Miguel serving as witnesses, and most of the town turning out for the ceremony. Grace wore a dress that Rosa had helped her sew from fabric Xavier had bought at the general store, a beautiful cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xavier wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaved, and when Grace walked down the aisle toward him, the look in his eyes took her breath away. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged vows in front of God and their community, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister said Xavier could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that made Grace's heart swell with love. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by nearly everyone in town. There was music and dancing, and Grace found herself swept into dances by ranch hands and neighbors alike, everyone congratulating her and welcoming her as the new Mrs. Fletcher. Xavier barely left her side all evening, his hand finding hers whenever they were close, his eyes following her whenever they were apart. As the sun began to set and the party wound down, Xavier and Grace said goodbye to their guests and finally retreated into the ranch house. Grace felt nervous butterflies in her stomach, knowing what the night would bring, but when Xavier took her hand and led her upstairs to the bedroom they would now share, his touch was gentle and reassuring. "Are you all right?" he asked, closing the door behind them. "If you need more time, we can wait. There is no rush." Grace looked at this man who had saved her, who had fallen in love with her, who had promised to spend his life with her, and she felt a surge of certainty and desire. "I do not want to wait," she said. "I want to be your wife in every way, Xavier." He kissed her then, slowly and deeply, and Grace let herself sink into the sensation, trusting him completely. Xavier was patient and tender, taking his time to show her the pleasures of physical intimacy, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Grace felt a completeness she had never known before. This was what love was supposed to be, she thought. Not a desperate arrangement for survival, but a genuine connection between two people who chose each other freely and completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Grace's head resting on Xavier's chest while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I will spend every day of my life trying to make you happy, Grace Fletcher." "I love you too," she replied, tilting her head up to kiss his jaw. "And I am already happy. You have given me everything I never thought I could have. A home, a partner, a future. I will spend my life trying to be worthy of that gift." "You are already worthy," Xavier said. "You were always worthy. The world just had not caught up with recognizing it yet." The first months of their marriage were a period of adjustment and discovery. Grace learned the rhythms of ranch life, the seasonal patterns of cattle management, the personalities of the various ranch hands and neighbors who made up their community. She took over most of the household management from Rosa, though the older woman still came several times a week to help with heavy cleaning and to visit. Grace also started teaching reading lessons to some of the ranch hands who had never learned, holding informal classes in the evenings after dinner. Word spread, and soon she had a small group of students, including a few children from neighboring ranches whose parents brought them for weekly lessons. Xavier watched her teach with pride, seeing how she came alive when sharing knowledge with others. The ranch prospered under Xavier's management, and he made sure that Grace understood she was his partner in all decisions. He taught her about the cattle business, asked her opinion on purchases and sales, and made her an equal voice in how their money was spent and saved. Grace had never expected to have this kind of partnership in marriage, where her thoughts and feelings mattered as much as her husband's, and she treasured it. They had their first real argument about 4 months into their marriage, when Xavier wanted to buy a neighboring property that was for sale and Grace thought the price was too high and the expansion too risky. The discussion became heated, with both of them frustrated that the other could not see their perspective. But instead of one of them shutting down or walking away, they kept talking, working through their concerns until they reached a compromise, agreeing to make an offer below the asking price and only proceed if the seller accepted the lower amount. "This is what marriage is supposed to be," Xavier said that night as they made up in bed. "Not always agreeing, but always working together to find solutions. I am sorry I raised my voice earlier." "I am sorry too," Grace said. "And I am glad we can disagree without it meaning we love each other any less." "I will always love you," Xavier said firmly, "even when you are being stubborn about property purchases." "And I will always love you," Grace replied with a smile, "even when you are being impulsive about expansion plans." They laughed together, and the tension that had hung between them all day dissolved completely. As winter approached, Grace began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses had stopped, and she felt nauseated in the mornings. She waited a few more weeks to be certain before telling Xavier, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. Finally, in early December, she told him over dinner, "Xavier, I have something important to tell you." He looked up from his plate, instantly attentive. "What is it?" "Is everything all right?" "Everything is wonderful," Grace said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." Xavier stared at her for a moment, his expression shocked and then transforming into pure joy. He jumped up from his chair, came around the table and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, that is the best news I have ever received. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to see a doctor? What can I do?" Grace laughed at his sudden flurry of concern. "I am feeling fine, just a bit nauseated in the mornings. And yes, I will see Dr. Harrison in town next week. But Xavier, I am healthy and strong. Women have been having babies for thousands of years." "Not my wife having my baby," Xavier said, kneeling down and placing his hands on her still flat stomach. "This is different. This is everything." The pregnancy progressed normally, with Grace experiencing the usual discomforts but remaining relatively healthy. Xavier became even more protective and attentive, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work and fretting whenever she felt tired or unwell. Grace found his concern endearing even when it became excessive, and Rosa helped her gently manage Xavier's overprotectiveness. "Men always think they know better when a woman is carrying," Rosa said with amusement. "Just pat his hand and do what you know is right for your body. He will calm down eventually." Grace gave birth in July of 1877 on a hot afternoon with Rosa and the doctor in attendance. Xavier paced outside the bedroom, prevented by propriety from being present, and when he finally heard the sharp cry of a newborn, he nearly broke down the door in his eagerness to get inside. "You have a son," Grace said tiredly, holding the small bundle wrapped in a blanket. "A healthy, loud son." Xavier approached the bed as if he were walking on sacred ground, his eyes fixed on the baby. When he finally took his son in his arms, Grace saw tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Xavier whispered. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect. Thank you. Thank you for this gift." They named him Samuel, after Xavier's father who had died when Xavier was young. Samuel Fletcher had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-blue eyes, and from the beginning, he was a happy, curious baby who seemed fascinated by everything around him. Parenthood changed them both in ways they had not expected. Xavier, who had always been serious and focused on ranch work, became playful and silly with his son, making funny faces to elicit giggles and carrying Samuel around the ranch in a sling so the baby could see everything. Grace discovered reserves of patience and love she had not known she possessed, finding joy in every small milestone, every new sound Samuel made. The ranch continued to prosper, and 2 years after Samuel was born, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder, with more severe nausea and tiredness, but she delivered a healthy daughter in the spring of 1880. They named her Elizabeth, after Grace's mother, and the little girl had her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes. Xavier was utterly smitten with his daughter, declaring that she was the most beautiful baby ever born, and that he would probably need to buy several shotguns to ward off suitors when she got older. Grace laughed at his declarations, but secretly loved seeing the fierce tenderness with which he held his tiny daughter. Life settled into a busy, happy routine. Samuel grew into an active, talkative child who followed his father everywhere and peppered everyone with endless questions. Elizabeth was quieter but observant, watching everything with serious eyes. Grace continued teaching informal lessons, now including Samuel in the group, and Xavier expanded the ranch gradually and carefully, always making sure to discuss major decisions with his wife. They had their challenges, of course. There were years when drought threatened the cattle, years when beef prices dropped and money was tight, years when illness swept through the valley. But they faced everything together, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the good ones. One evening when Samuel was 6 and Elizabeth was 3, Grace and Xavier sat on the front porch watching their children play in the yard. The sun was setting behind Mount Shasta, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Xavier had his arm around Grace's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly content. "You ever think about that day we met?" Xavier asked. "You stumbling off the stagecoach with those debt collectors hounding you." "I think about it often," Grace admitted. "I think about how terrified I was, how certain I was that my life was ruined beyond repair, and then you appeared and changed everything." "We changed everything together," Xavier corrected gently. "I may have paid off those fraudulent debts, but you were the one who had the courage to accept help, to trust a stranger, to build a new life from nothing. That takes strength, Grace." "I had a good partner," she said, tilting her head up to kiss his cheek. "Everything I have built, I built with you beside me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Samuel help his little sister climb onto the porch railing under their watchful supervision. Grace thought about the scared, desperate woman she had been 4 years ago, arriving in Yreka with nothing but debts and broken dreams. That woman would never have believed that such happiness was possible, that life could be full of love and laughter and purpose. "I want to tell you something," Grace said suddenly. "I never properly thanked you for what you did that day, not just paying the money, but believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself. You saw something worth saving when I felt worthless. That gift is something I can never fully repay, but I want you to know that I am grateful every single day." Xavier turned to look at her, his blue eyes soft with love. "Grace Fletcher, you have repaid me 1,000 times over simply by being yourself, by sharing your life with me, by giving me a family and a home filled with love. I am the one who should be grateful. That day I met you was the day my real life began." "No," Grace said with a smile. "That day was when both our real lives began, together." Xavier kissed her then, a sweet, lingering kiss that still made her heart race even after years of marriage. Samuel made a disgusted noise from across the yard, declaring that kissing was gross, and they broke apart laughing. As the years passed, the Fletcher Ranch became known throughout the region not just for its quality cattle, but for the warm hospitality of its owners. Grace and Xavier were respected in the community, known for their fairness in business and their willingness to help neighbors in need. Grace eventually did become a formal teacher, running a small school on the ranch property for children from the surrounding area. Xavier served on the town council and helped establish better infrastructure for the growing region. Samuel grew into a responsible young man who loved ranch life and showed a natural talent for working with horses. Elizabeth developed a passion for books and learning, often helping her mother teach the younger students. When Samuel was 16, Xavier began officially training him to take over the ranch eventually, teaching him not just the practical skills but the importance of treating workers fairly and being a good steward of the land. Grace and Xavier's marriage only deepened over time. They had the easy intimacy of people who had weathered storms together and come out stronger. They could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, finish each other's sentences, and still surprise each other with small gestures of love and appreciation. Their bedroom remained a sanctuary where they reconnected physically and emotionally, their passion for each other never dimming even as their hair began to gray and lines appeared on their faces. They had one more child, a surprise pregnancy when Grace was 40 years old, and they thought they were done with babies. A son they named James, who arrived healthy and squalling in the winter of 1891. Samuel and Elizabeth, now teenagers, were simultaneously mortified and delighted to have a baby brother, and little James grew up thoroughly spoiled by his older siblings. When Samuel turned 21 in 1898, he married a local girl named Catherine, and they built a house on the eastern section of the ranch property. Grace and Xavier became grandparents the following year when Catherine gave birth to twin boys. Watching Xavier with his grandsons, seeing the same tenderness and joy he had shown with his own children, Grace felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the life they had built together. Elizabeth surprised everyone by deciding to attend normal school in Sacramento to become a certified teacher. Xavier struggled with letting his daughter move to the city, but Grace reminded him that they had raised their children to be independent and follow their dreams. Elizabeth wrote letters home every week, full of excitement about her studies and the new ideas she was learning. She eventually returned to Yreka and took over running the school from her mother, implementing progressive teaching methods that became a model for other rural schools in the region. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1901, Xavier and Grace renewed their vows in the same church where they had married, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and the community they had helped build. Grace was 50 years old now, her dark blonde hair streaked with silver, her face lined from years of sun and laughter. Xavier was 53, his dark hair mostly gray, his body still strong from ranch work, but bearing the marks of hard physical labor over the decades. 25 years ago, I thought I was coming to California for a marriage of convenience, Grace said in her vow renewal speech. Instead, I found a love story beyond my wildest dreams. Xavier Fletcher, you have been my partner, my best friend, my greatest adventure. Thank you for 25 years of love, laughter, challenges, and joy. I look forward to 25 more. Xavier's voice was thick with emotion as he spoke his own vows. "Grace, you walked into my life when I had stopped believing I would ever find true love. You brought light and laughter into a house that had been dark for too long. You have given me children, grandchildren, a partnership that has made me a better man. Every day with you is a gift I never take for granted. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." There was not a dry eye in the church when they kissed to seal their renewed vows. James grew into a bright, inquisitive young man who was fascinated by the new technologies emerging at the turn of the century. He read everything he could about electricity, automobiles, and aviation, dreaming of a future that looked very different from the ranching life of his parents. Xavier struggled with this at first, wanting his youngest son to carry on the family tradition, but Grace reminded him that they had raised their children to think for themselves. "Let him find his own path," she said gently. "Samuel is carrying on the ranch legacy. Elizabeth is carrying on the teaching legacy. James will create his own legacy, and we will be proud of him no matter what that looks like." Xavier sighed but acknowledged she was right. "When did you become so wise?" he asked. "I learned from you," Grace said with a smile. "You taught me that love means supporting people in being who they are, not who we want them to be. Remember when you supported my teaching even though some men would have wanted their wives to stay home?" "That was different," Xavier protested. "Teaching was a respectable occupation. And whatever James chooses will be respectable too, because he is a good young man who we raised well," Grace said firmly. "Trust in that." In the end, James went to university in San Francisco to study engineering, writing home excitedly about the incredible innovations being developed in the new century. Xavier grumbled about losing another child to the city, but Grace could see the pride in his eyes when he read James's letters aloud at the dinner table. As Grace and Xavier moved into their 60s, they gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Samuel, though Xavier still rode out most days to check on the cattle and help with whatever work needed doing. Grace continued teaching part-time, though Elizabeth had officially taken over the school. They spent more time together, taking long rides through the property, sitting on the porch in the evenings, traveling to San Francisco occasionally to visit James. "You have any regrets?" Xavier asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage. Grace thought about the question carefully. "I regret that I did not meet you sooner, that we did not have more years together. But I do not regret anything that brought me to that stagecoach stop in Yreka in 1876. All the pain, all the fear, all the struggle led me to you. How could I regret the path that gave me this life?" Xavier took her hand, his fingers still strong despite the arthritis that was beginning to set in. "I regret that I could not save my sister Sarah. But you are right. If she had lived, my life would have been different. I might never have been in Yreka that day to meet you. And as much as I miss Sarah, I cannot imagine a life without you." They sat in silence, holding hands, watching the sun sink behind the mountains they had called home for so long. Their love had started with an act of unexpected kindness, a cowboy paying off a stranger's debts without question or expectation. It had grown into a partnership that had weathered decades, raised children, built businesses, and created a legacy that extended beyond just the two of them. Samuel and Catherine had 4 children in total. Elizabeth married a teacher from Sacramento and had 3 children of her own. James married a suffragette he met at university, and they had 2 daughters who Xavier declared were going to change the world someday. Grace and Xavier's descendants multiplied, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter during holidays and celebrations. In 1914, Xavier turned 66 and finally admitted that perhaps he should slow down a bit. He and Grace officially retired, signing over full ownership of the ranch to Samuel while retaining their house and a small income. They spent their retirement traveling, visiting their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company after decades of hard work. Grace sometimes looked back at that scared, debt-ridden woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Yreka nearly 40 years earlier and marveled at the transformation. She had gone from having nothing but debts to having everything that mattered: love, family, purpose, and a partner who had stood beside her through it all. On a warm evening in the summer of 1918, Grace and Xavier sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Xavier was 70 now, his hair white, his face deeply lined but still handsome. Grace was 67, her body showing the effects of age but her mind still sharp and her heart still full. They held hands, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard under the supervision of their parents. "Did I ever tell you that I loved you?" Xavier asked, a twinkle in his eye. "Once or twice," Grace replied with a smile, "but I never get tired of hearing it. I love you, Grace Fletcher. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too, Xavier Fletcher. You saved my life in more ways than I can count." "We saved each other," he corrected gently, and Grace had to admit he was right. They had saved each other that day when a cowboy paid a stranger's debts without question, and a mail-order bride found love instead of just security. They had built a life together based on mutual respect, deep love, and the simple belief that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with an act of unexpected kindness. As the sun set on another day, painting the California sky in brilliant colors, Grace leaned her head on Xavier's shoulder and felt utterly at peace. This was what happiness looked like, she thought. Not the absence of struggle or pain, but the presence of love strong enough to weather anything life threw at them. Their story had begun with nothing but debts and desperation. It had become a love story for the ages, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected beginnings. Grace had come to Yreka with nothing but debts. Xavier had paid them all without question. And in return, they had given each other a lifetime of love, a legacy of family, and a happiness that multiplied with each passing year. That night, after the grandchildren had gone home and the house was quiet, Xavier and Grace climbed the stairs to their bedroom, moving more slowly than they once had but still together. They got ready for bed in the comfortable routine of long marriage, and when they finally settled under the covers, Xavier pulled Grace close the way he had done for 42 years. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" Grace asked, snuggling closer to his warmth. "For saying yes. For trusting me. For building this life with me. For everything." Grace tilted her head up to kiss him, a gentle brush of lips that still held the promise and passion of their younger days. "Thank you for being the kind of man worth saying yes to. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for loving me." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that whatever time they had left would be spent together. The mail-order bride and the cowboy who had saved her, still in love after all these years. Still grateful for the day their paths had crossed on a dusty street in Yreka, California. Their love story was proof that sometimes the greatest romances do not begin with love at first sight or grand romantic gestures. Sometimes they begin with simple kindness, with someone seeing another person in need and choosing to help without expecting anything in return. Sometimes they begin with nothing but debts and end with everything that truly matters. Grace and Xavier Fletcher lived to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary in 1926. surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who all existed because a cowboy once paid a stranger's debts without question, and a woman had the courage to trust in that kindness. Their love had started with an act of generosity and had grown into something that would echo through generations, a testament to the transformative power of compassion, courage, and love. And every evening until the very end, they sat together on their porch, holding hands and watching the sun set behind the mountains, grateful for every moment of the beautiful life they had built together.